Hello, this is Dr. Laist. Last week we discussed the most basic elements of narrative, plot, characters, and setting. This week I want to turn our attention to a fourth basic element of narrative that is always present whenever we deal with stories, the element of what stories mean, an aspect of narrative that we can refer to as the story's significance. Unlike the other three elements of narrative, the significance of a literary text is not directly stated. Defining the significance of a literary work requires an act of interpretation on the part of the reader. The most basic kind of significance a story can be said to have is the story's moral, a specific message that the story seems intended to teach its audience. Although the concept of a moral is well known and can be extremely useful when it comes to analyzing stories, literary critics, people who analyze stories for a living, rarely describe a story in terms of its moral. The reason that this is so is probably because describing a story in terms of its moral tends to reduce the complexity of a narrative to a bumper sticker style slogan, which may help to shed some light on the significance of the story, but which may also keep us from looking at the story more closely. A moral is often thought of as the solution to a story, but a story should not be thought of as a problem to be solved, but as a continent to be explored. The closer we look at a story, the more likely we are to notice new perspectives. The significance that we discover in a story, therefore, will usually depend on what aspects of the story we choose to emphasize and how we interpret them. Of course, what we emphasize will usually be determined by the assumptions we make, not only about stories, but about the world in general. What we find in a story is usually what we were looking for, whether we knew that we were looking for it or not. One of the extremely valuable benefits to writing about literature is that it gives writers an opportunity to identify and examine their own assumptions. When we described Jack and Jill as a story about human beings lost in a tragic landscape of pain and failure, we were making a background assumption that literary texts describe a vision of the human condition. This is a convincing assumption to make, and it can produce very compelling interpretations of stories, but it is important to note that it is only one of many different ways of thinking about a story. We can think of it as the existential approach to literary criticism. Existential is a big word, but it simply refers to the immediate facts of human existence: life, love, death, hate, hope, fear, and those universal experiences which make up our day-to-day lives. From an existential approach, the character of Cinderella represents the typical human being. The evil stepsisters who abuse Cinderella represent the pain, anxiety, and injustice that keep human beings in a degraded position. Marriage to the prince would represent the prospect of living with dignity and self-mastery. Once we chart out this interpretation of the beginning and the end of the Cinderella story, we can ask what the story tells us about how human beings can progress from the state of fear and submission into a state of serenity and supremacy. When we read the story this way, the Cinderella story seems to suggest that people can't really do anything for themselves to make this movement. If they are anything like Cinderella, they have to rely on the dumb luck of having a magical fairy godmother. A slightly different spin on the existential approach would be to read the story within the framework of some particular religion. Since the most familiar version of the Cinderella story comes from Europe, it may make sense to think about it in a Christian framework. From the perspective of the Christian religion, Cinderella would represent the human soul, the tyranny of the stepsisters would represent the soul's enslavement to sin and death, and the fairy godmother may represent the power of grace to enter into the life of the soul and transfigure it. The prince may represent Jesus Christ, and his search for Cinderella after she has left her glass slipper behind may remind us of Jesus' parable about the shepherd who goes out in search of his lost sheep. The marriage of Cinderella and the prince represents the soul's holy union with Christ and its ascent into the happily ever after of eternal paradise. Other religious traditions could certainly be substituted for Christianity to generate other kinds of interpretations of Cinderella as an allegory of the fate of the soul. But of course, it is also possible to think of Cinderella not just as an abstract person or soul, but specifically as a woman. When we shift our focus in this way, we move from an existential approach to a feminist approach. Cinderella is no longer a victim of the human condition, but of a sexist society that literally enslaves women to a lifetime of domestic drudgery. Cinderella's very name refers to the cinders that she was responsible for cleaning out of the stove, and it reflects her subjugation. Cinderella's evil stepsisters might represent the manner in which women themselves may participate in sexist power structures. From this perspective, the fairy godmother may represent girl power, the magical feminine principle that provides a woman with personal inner strength. The fairy godmother's wand may represent her appropriation of the male phallus, as if she has snatched the penis scepter out of the hands of males and is using it for her own purposes. Depending on what school of feminism you side with, you may see Cinderella's engagement to the prince as either a sign that women can become equals of men and share power with them, or you might see Cinderella as a sellout who only traded one kind of subjugation at the hands of her stepsisters for a cushier but no less disempowering form of subjection at the hand of her husband king. It is also possible, however, to think of Cinderella not just as a person and not just as a woman, but as someone who is extremely poor. When we emphasize the role played by wealth and poverty in a story, we are taking on what is called a Marxist approach to literary analysis. From this Marxist perspective, the first thing we notice about the story is that Cinderella is being kept in abject poverty while the prince is living in a fantastic castle right down the road throwing elaborate balls. The evilness of the evil stepsisters, which consists of treating Cinderella as a second-class citizen, becomes easier to understand when we perceive that the stepsisters themselves are second-class citizens, commoners living in the shadow of the royal castle. Their cruelty towards Cinderella is simply an extension of the cruelty which the class system has shown toward them. The stepsisters' war on Cinderella is a classic example of the middle class attacking itself rather than challenging the status of the wealthy class. The fairy godmother, in this reading, represents the American dream of upward mobility, and of course, Cinderella's story has become American slang for any rags-to-riches biography. But in her move from poor washerwoman to wealthy princess, Cinderella as a character, and any other hero of a Cinderella story, affirms the basic soundness of the class system as it exists. By suggesting that good people will magically be promoted to the top of the social hierarchy, the Cinderella story is arguably a work of capitalist propaganda that persuades people not to complain about the exploitation of poor people by wealthy people, because someday you may meet your fairy godmother and get to be one of the wealthy people yourself. It is a natural step from this Marxist perspective to consider the actual historical circumstances that surround the composition and popularization of the Cinderella story. Elements of the Cinderella tale have been traced as far back as ancient Greece, but the story we are most familiar with gained popularity as one of Grimm's fables in the early 19th century. In the half-century following the American and French revolutions, the legitimacy of monarchical governments was a question of great social concern. A parable that seemed to soften and legitimize monarchy by implying that any country girl could be welcomed into the halls of power simply by patience and perseverance may have helped to take the edge off this anxiety to some extent. Cinderella's renewed popularity in the United States following the release of the 1950 Disney movie may have performed a similar service for Cold War-era Americans defending the class-based system of American capitalism against the Soviet ideal of a classless society. When you hold a glass slipper up to the light separates into prismatic refractions. Bursts of glare leap out at you. Inner and outer surfaces melt into a single shape. You may notice tiny fractures and imperfections, and you may catch glimpses of your own reflection. The existential, religious, feminist, Marxist, and historical perspectives we have been discussing, along with many other perspectives that we will encounter in this class, can provide ways of making sense of the sparkling multiplicity of literary interpretation.